Good evening. Thank you for coming. This is a meeting of the Conservation Commission. It is Tuesday, April 23rd at 8:08 p.m. The intent of tonight's meeting is to talk a little bit about the Wetlands Protection Bylaw that is on the warrant for town meeting on Saturday. We're going to talk a little bit about the bylaw, provide some facts, and at the end, people are welcome to ask any questions that they may have. So let's get started. Just a little background on the Conservation Commission. We were established to protect the town's natural resources in regulatory and advisory manner. We're responsible for administration of the Wetlands Protection Act and the local Wetlands Bylaw. We're an advisor to the floodplains zoning bylaw and an advisor to other town committees, and we provide information to the town on environmental planning efforts. We are appointed by the town administrator. Current members include myself, Kristen Kent, Ellen Steves, Henry Hall, Meredith Thibault, Tom Familari, and Ben Harvey. Carol Crawford was unable to join us this evening. So first we'll take a look at the Wetlands Protection Act versus the Wetlands Protection Bylaw. We'll compare and contrast what the differences are. The Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, they have jurisdiction over coastal wetlands, which include beaches, bank, dune, land under the ocean, rocky intertidal shores. There's a number of different resource areas that fall under that. They also have jurisdiction over inland wetlands, which include bordering vegetated wetlands, streams, banks. It controls floodplain, which is mapped by FEMA, and areas within 100 feet of coastal and inland wetlands, and that area is called the buffer zone. The Wetlands Protection Bylaw also regulates coastal wetlands, inland wetlands, floodplain as mapped by FEMA, and areas within 100 feet of coastal and inland wetlands. We also added areas within 100 feet of floodplain. So the difference is that the bylaw regulates areas within 100 feet of floodplain. Why? Because property owners adjacent to floodplain can unintentionally exacerbate flooding for their neighbors and town infrastructure as a result of the addition of impervious surfaces or changes to the way that water flows across their property. In some cases, the 100-foot buffer zone that was added to the floodplain is an area where FEMA will in the future expand their mapped floodplain. Regulations. The Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act regulates coastal wetlands. They have very specific performance standards for the work in resource areas. Inland wetlands have specific performance standards. Coastal floodplain has no specific performance standards. Inland floodplain does, coastal does not. So the difference is the Wetlands Protection Bylaw has specific performance standards for coastal floodplain, something that the Wetlands Protection Act does not have. For some reason, the State Wetlands Act is very strong in their protection of other wetlands and resource areas, but silent on coastal floodplain. It's something they've been working on for years and years. They have not been able to figure out a solution for that. So for us, it's one of our most critical resource areas, coastal floodplain, and it needs to be more strictly reviewed to prevent unintended consequences for our neighbors and town infrastructure in low-lying areas. Exemptions. Under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, all minor buffer zone activities set forth in the law cited are permitted without a permit. Those include unpaved pedestrian walkways, certain types of fencing, vista pruning, native tree, shrub, and ground cover plantings, conversion of lawn to decks, sheds, patios, and pools, as long as the work is more than 50 feet from a wetland, conversion of impervious to vegetated surfaces, and temporary planning work for planning structure purposes. For example, monitoring wells or borings. The Wetlands Protection Act has the same exemptions, but goes further in that it also allows for lawn maintenance and landscaping, most repair, maintenance, and improvement to existing structures or buildings, maintenance, repair, and replacement of public utilities, and work performed by the Mosquito Control Board. The purpose of this is to allow the town to review activities that might adversely impact resource areas while still allowing residents to maintain their properties. Filing with the Conservation Commission under the Wetlands Bylaw mirrors the process set out by the State Wetlands Protection Act. The forms are the same, the fees use the same structure with reduced rates for single-family homes, the hearing process is the same, the timelines are the same, and permits are in the same format. This streamlines the process for property owners and makes it easier and less confusing. Appeals. Under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, an appeal of an adverse decision is first to the Department of Environmental Protection. If you get an adverse decision from them, you then would go to court. Under the Wetlands Protection Bylaw, an adverse decision is appealed to Superior Court. So this is a function of state law. This is not a change to the state wetlands rules. Mass DEP does not have jurisdiction over local wetlands bylaws, nor would they want to. It would be overwhelming for them. An appeal of a wetlands bylaw decision is governed by state statute, which provides for an appeal to Superior Court. This is the law, in case anybody's interested. So just a couple of facts about wetlands and floodplains and why they're important. Wetlands absorb wave energy and reduce the height of storm waves. Wetland plants bind the soil and help slow shoreline erosion. That's why DCR did the massive dune restoration project along Long Beach. That's why we've tried to do some work along the Short Beach dune. Wetlands temporarily store floodwaters. Paved areas cannot absorb floodwaters and increase the speed of floodwaters and storm damage. They provide wildlife habitat. And in economic terms, the cost of preserving wetlands is far lower than the cost of repairing property that's been damaged or building structures or facilities to replace wetland functions. So this is a map that everybody got sent to their home. The color's obviously off. But the green towns are the inland towns that have wetlands protections bylaws, and the pink are the coastal towns. One glaring omission is Boston. They're currently working on a bylaw. They're using climate change projections for their buffer zones, so that's a pretty significant step that they're taking, that they're building that into their planning process. FEMA flood maps and flood insurance. Local wetlands protection bylaws do not alter, they don't expand or change the floodplain or FEMA maps. Both the Wetlands Protection Act and the local bylaw rely on FEMA's maps to determine the extent of floodplain, also known as land subject to coastal storm flowage. The bylaw cannot and does not expand FEMA's jurisdiction. FEMA relies on science and data to establish floodplains, not the language of local wetlands bylaws. A couple years ago, the town of Nahant hired a engineering firm, and they did engineering calculations for us, and they were able to show that FEMA's maps were wrong based on that, and so we requested that FEMA change their maps, and they did, and it was based on engineering and local data. It was not based on anything other than that. That's what they make their maps based on. The local wetlands protection bylaw will not change the flood insurance maps, therefore it does not change anyone's need for flood insurance. Flood insurance is based on whether or not you're in the floodplain as mapped by FEMA, and the amount that you pay is dictated by a number of factors, including the location of your property in the flood zone, the design and age of your home. Certain areas are high risk, some are not. So if you have questions on flood insurance, I encourage you to call your insurance agent and ask what factors go into setting insurance rates, whether or not this changes things for you. It won't. So as far as the delineation, you guys have all seen the maps before. This is the little Nahant map. The pink is the area already protected by the State Wetlands Protection Act. The orange is the 100-foot buffer zone. And then again, pink is regulated by the State Wetlands Protection Act. Orange is the 100-foot buffer zone from those areas, which is also regulated by the State Wetlands Protection Act. And the yellow is the area added as a result of the addition of the wetland bylaw. So that's just some general facts about the Wetlands Protection Bylaw. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hi, Mike Raworth, 31 Summer Street. I just want to clarify a few points that you made in the slides. First of all, the appeal regime that you mentioned, I gather that there was no opportunity in adopting the Wetlands Bylaw or adopting the regulations to change the appeal procedure that's governed by state statute above our pay grade.
Correct.
And so that appeal procedure that you described with respect to our Wetlands Bylaw is also the same in all of the pink communities in the map that you just illustrated?
Yes. Many don't, I would say it's 50-50. Some specify that it's Superior Court, others do not. It's just dictated by the statute, which would be state court or land court.
So the appeal is to state Superior Court, whether it's stated in a local bylaw or not?
Yes.
Okay, great. Then you mentioned that the FEMA flood areas might be expanded into the 100-foot buffer zone, but let me just clarify that that would be as a result of something done internally to FEMA, not as a result of the establishment of the bylaw.
Correct.
So that expansion could happen whether we had a bylaw or not.
Yes, that expansion will happen in the future. FEMA in the future is slowly going to expand their floodplain.
All right, independently of anything that's done here locally?
Correct.
Okay. And then third, you mentioned the exemptions that apply under the local wetlands bylaw, the Nahant Wetlands Bylaw. And I just want to clarify that the list that you had on the right-hand side of the screen are exemptions that are in addition to the ones that are provided for in the statute that were shown on the left-hand side of the screen under the state statute.
Correct.
So the list on the right is in addition to every single exemption that's listed on the left.
Correct.
Great. Thanks very kindly.
Thank you. And I also just want to mention that FEMA actually encourages the adoption of stricter floodplain regulations under their community rating system. They actually give points to towns who adopt stricter regulations as a way of protecting themselves. So it's something that will actually help lower our flood insurance premiums if we're accepted into that program.
Bill Mahoney, 179 Willow. I was just looking at the advisory and finance statement, and could you discuss, it says the bylaw affects hundreds of homeowners already within the protected area, not just the approximately 70, 75 or whatever it is. Could you could you explain that further, please?
Yeah, so that's true. Everyone that's affected by the Wetlands Protection Act is also affected by the Wetlands Protection Bylaw. So if you are already under the jurisdiction of that, you are also under the jurisdiction of the bylaw. The intent of that is, again, there is no state performance standards for work in floodplains. So what the bylaw does is provide for performance standards. They're basic things like, not significantly changing the way water flows across your property, not adding impervious that causes you to flood your neighbors, things like that. So we added those, and that applies to everybody in the town.
Okay.
Excuse me, everyone under the Wetlands Protection Act and under the bylaw.
So, let me get it. The yellow lines, for instance, it's uphill of the wetlands, the state wetlands
Theoretically, yeah.
designation.
Yeah.
And the water usually flows downhill, especially
Right.
impervious areas. So this law is trying to mediate the amount of water going into a wetland or going downhill into a neighbor's
Into a floodplain.
yard,
Right.
cellar.
Correct.
That's one of the key.
Yes, that is the
Yes.
key.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Hi, B. Rogers, 44 Pearl Road. I guess I went to both of the hearings on the rules and regulations. I was very happy to hear some of the explanations that you gave. And I have to say it was very clear and much more in the spirit of information at that time than advocacy. And I felt really bad, and I still do, that the specific issues that you identified that are needed were not the subject of this bylaw, that the bylaw, as it's no secret that I believe, is too extensive, too vague, too broad, too expansive, and it doesn't target the specific issues that you very clearly have laid out. So that's one of my reasons for hoping that the bylaw, for not supporting this bylaw, which I didn't and I still don't, is that it took a couple of logical things and leaped into a kind of very much more expanded set of jurisdictions and controls and so on. I think I can't speak better than the warrant article, the FinCom statement. I think it was very extensive and clear, but I'm just saying that when, if you articulate things that we need, and the FinCom statement articulated some other things that we need, it's too bad that the law didn't focus on those. And you explain very clearly that the wetlands protection bylaw can't be appealed in DEP because of, as you've very clearly explained. But it doesn't seem as though the Conservation Commission or anyone else said, gee, maybe that's a reason not to do this. Maybe we should narrow the focus so that the need to go to Superior Court wouldn't be quite so extensive, but would only be under these particular things. So I know that, I don't know about the whole Conservation Commission, but I know that you have sort of said, if it gets repealed, that's it. And I would say if it gets repealed, maybe it could be rethought in a way that addresses the specifics and doesn't have quite such an enormous reach and sweep. And the only other comment I want to make is that in the statute it says applications and permits shall not be required only to the extent that they take place outside of the wetland. And I remember having some discussion about exemptions and exemptions taking place, exemptions are within the protected area, but my reading of this is that that's not true. But I'm just saying that I think maybe you're right, we could use a bylaw that addresses some specific things, but a bylaw that doesn't have the negative consequences, that addresses some of the issues raised by the FinCom, and that is more narrowly targeted, I think would be something that perhaps the town could benefit from.
Did you have a question, or was it just general statement?
It was a general statement.
Okay. I just want to clarify.
I guess I could say. And the question is, do you agree?
I don't. We're not breaking new ground here. We are not the first town to get one of these. I mean, look at the map. This is not new ground. And I'm not saying we should do it because everybody else does. We should do it because it's important. We have a problem here, and quite frankly, if this northeastern issue hadn't come up, maybe we would have never done this. And that's fine. We would have continued on our way. We would have looked for grants after every storm. We would have tried to fix things instead of be proactive, and maybe that's okay. But I don't, this is what I do professionally. I'm a wetland scientist, and I really think this is important. Lots of towns throughout the Commonwealth do this. I work for one town that has a bylaw. I work for another that does not. The town without the bylaw, they're getting overrun with development. People are flooding each other. It's a pro-development town, and they're having some major issues. And it's something that we're really trying to convince people that this is a good thing, because every single Conservation Commission meeting they come to and they say, why don't we have a bylaw? What can we do to protect ourselves? And the answer is, we need to propose a bylaw. If you care about it, you need to propose a bylaw. This isn't breaking new ground. This is the way Wetlands Protection Act bylaws are written. There are a lot of towns that have very similar ones. For example, Revere, they have a very similar one where they have a 100-foot buffer zone off a floodplain. Appeals also go to Superior Court, very similar. They don't have a conservation agent. They have a very similar model to us. They have similar problems to what we have. And so, I think other communities that are similar to us and have problems like we do have these. So while I appreciate people's concerns, and I understand that people think this could be better addressed by a stormwater bylaw, unfortunately, the town adopted the minimum. They didn't go above and beyond. And if people, if we enlarged the reach of the stormwater bylaw, that would be a decision that's also appealed to Superior Court. So you're not getting away from Superior Court by having this. So, abandoning one thing in hopes that maybe we can come up with something better, I don't think is the answer. Why are we in such a rush to repeal this when we could work together if there are concerns and amend the bylaw? To me, erasing something positive in hopes of finding something better is not the solution.
I think that, and I just wanted to further that
Pull the
point.
microphone closer to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to further that point. I think that there's been, the way this has been shaped makes it seem like Nahant is an outlier by putting this bylaw in place. The fact is, Nahant was an outlier by not having a bylaw. It's also being shaped as if it's the Conservation Committee that really did an overreach when they put a regulation down. Actually, this regulation very closely mirrors many of the other regulations that these coastal towns have. And so I just think that if we're going to be honest here, the honest truth is what this has done is brought us far closer and in line with the vast majority of coastal towns in Massachusetts. And I think it is very fair and fine for this town to say we don't want a coastal bylaw. But I don't think that we should say we don't want a coastal bylaw because we're out there in left field by having a coastal bylaw. The fact is we're out there in left field by not having a coastal bylaw.
What Bill Mahoney brought up reminded me of something that I forgot to bring up. Just let me clarify what you said in your presentation. That is that as to certain realms, I think it is coastal floodplain, there was an absence of articulated standards in the state statute. So in other words, without the Wetlands Bylaw, there would be greater ambiguity in any decision that the Concom would face. And that the bylaw introduces greater objective standards to guide the decisions of the Concom in dealing with any issue that might come up. And that provides greater clarity for any homeowner who might have an issue before the Concom. Have I got that right?
Yes, correct. The performance standards are clearly articulated in the regulations in Section 5C, and in the Wetlands Protection Act, there are no standards. It gives a definition, but it provides no additional information, so it's a gaping hole in the State Wetlands Protection Act.
Bill Mahoney again. One of the other points in this booklet has to do with why not all the way up to the high ground in Nahant. And I think I know, but why don't you tell me why it's not high ground?
That would certainly be an option. I think that that's better addressed by a stormwater bylaw all the way up to, the top Nahant Road. I think that's better addressed by a stormwater bylaw, but we could certainly do that. The yellow zone is kind of an area where it's not perfect, but it's an area where floodplain in the future is going to expand. There are some areas in town where that's not a perfect alignment with what the future is, understandably. But there are many areas where in the future the floodplain is going to come up further. My house, for example, the floodplain line goes halfway through it right now. I'm half in the 100-foot buffer zone from floodplain. I'm half in floodplain. In the future, that floodplain is going to slowly encompass my entire house. And so really that's why we looked at it that way, is it's a way to look at areas that are going to be in the future.
Yeah, I looked at a lot of these towns online, conservation commissions, and most of them have a boundary zone similar. It seems to me you guys followed similar ideas from other.
Yeah. Yep, there are a number of other towns that have the same thing.
I didn't see anything that takes up the whole town, the entire town.
Peg Heinrichs, 31 Wharf Street. I think you referenced a point system that FEMA has, which I'd never heard about before, and the fact that they encourage towns to have a local bylaw. If you could elaborate on that a bit about why that is so, and that if we do continue to have this bylaw, do you automatically get points that might lower some insurance rates for some people, or is there another process, other conditions?
Good question. So FEMA has a program called the Community Rating System, and it's a program that you have to apply to and be accepted. Selectman Burrill has been working on it for some time. I worked with him on it a while back. We have not been accepted into the program yet in a manner that we're starting to reap the benefits, but if we continue down that road, what FEMA does is they have different categories for which they provide points, and when you have a certain number of points, residents are eligible for larger flood insurance reductions. So it's 5%, and it incrementally goes up. It is work to get into the program and to accumulate those, but one of the things that they do provide points for is stronger floodplain regulations.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Diane Monteith, 20 Seabreeze Lane. Are many people on your commission affected by the new bylaw? And what are your opinions on how you will be affected?
All of us are affected except Mr. Famulari. I'm personally not concerned because I don't see any capacity in which it's going to affect me personally. I'm not going to tear down my house. I don't plan any huge additions. I don't have any, I don't, like most people, I don't have a ton of space to work with. So for me, I don't see any reason why it's going to affect me. It may at some point if I put in a driveway or something like that, or if we choose to do an addition, but I certainly don't want to flood my neighbors. I already get water in my basement, so I don't want to do that to other people, and I don't want people to make it worse for me.
I can say from my standpoint, the property beside me, not the current owners, but in the past had some major changes in the way it was graded, which has resulted in significant additional flooding on our lot that probably would not be there but for that. I think that had these protections been in place, it could have been very helpful and saved us in that. But that said, I mean, every single one of these regulations do affect us, but I think that in the end, if we look at the history of this Conservation Committee, which I've only been on it for a little over a year, this is a Conservation Committee which history has shown has done everything in its power to help do what's right for the homeowners of Nahant. It is not denying applications. It is figuring out how can we achieve what that homeowner is trying to do in a way that doesn't put neighbors at risk. And that's why you don't see a lot of rejections of applications. In fact, we don't have an agent here, and many of our members go and help the homeowners fill out the paperwork and do the things they do, things that aren't available elsewhere. So in the end, would I rather be in front of this board and try, because I had to bring a project in front of this board, be in front of this board and have them make the decision? Or would I rather, if my neighbor's doing something that's flooding me, have to fight it out in court with them without this board able to give their opinion? I trust this board to give its opinion, and I think the history of this board shows that it's a board that should be trusted to give its opinion, that it's looking out for the good of the homeowner while it looks out for the good of the floodplain.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Just maybe to kind of flesh out the practical application of this thing to the ordinary homeowner, can you think of some examples of projects you've heard of, projects that have been discussed or considered in some way that were implicated by the new bylaw, and what, if anything, the commission did with respect to them? I mean, where is it most likely that this would have an effect on some homeowner, and what would be the probable effect? I know I'm talking hypothetically, asking you to talk hypothetically,
Yeah.
but I'm trusting in your creativity.
I think the primary situation where I can see this affecting people is if they're tearing down their house and building a new one. That is the major issue that we've seen, particularly in floodplain. So if somebody's tearing down a small house, putting up a much larger one, and adding large driveways and things like that, that has been the primary issue, I would say, that we've run into. There've been a number of them. Unfortunately, we haven't felt that we had the strength to have them make big changes because the Wetlands Protection Act doesn't provide for that. So it's caused some problems for neighbors in some situations, and for us, I think that's been the biggest thing. And there's a surprising number of, for such a small town, there've been a lot of tear downs and building bigger houses.
One more time, Bill Mahoney. My nephew just did that. He tore down a house and rebuilt, and he's got to get up tomorrow and go lobster at 4:30, so he's not here tonight. But we were talking about that today, and he said, "Yeah, you know, I've got a gravel driveway. I had to put some hay bales there, and a silt, silt barrier." He says it wasn't a big deal, wasn't heavy lift, and he got a lot of help from the commission. So just to let you know.
I mean, I think one of the biggest issues people are running into, particularly people that are already in floodplain or already in velocity zones, is FEMA has rules regarding how much you can improve your house. So people are wanting to rebuild a smaller house or add a second floor, and in order to do that, if you live on the ocean, FEMA requires that you comply with their regulations, and that's in the building code that is outside of our jurisdiction. So as a result, people aren't being able to do some of that work. So they aren't, or they're being required to elevate their house so that water can flow under, or they're putting in vents, or they're having to raise their utilities so they're off the ground. And so that's what a lot of people are running into right now. We have a couple people in town right now that are trying to figure out how to make improvements to an older house and comply with FEMA's regulations. And it's tough. It's going to start affecting more and more people, but it's in the building code, and it is not in the Conservation Commission's jurisdiction.
Once again, just so I can clarify, and I find the acoustics in the room badly serve us, so just to make sure that everybody can understand exactly, what you just said was referring to some projects in town where people were looking to do major work on a lot, but at a low elevation, close to the water's edge, and they were running into regulatory challenges because of that, but those are driven by the building code and are independent of what the Conservation Commission does, and likewise independent of the Wetlands Bylaw.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately, FEMA is confusing because although FEMA dictates the extent of floodplain, which is what we have jurisdiction over, everything else dictated by FEMA does not fall under our jurisdiction. So building requirements are in the building code. Flood insurance is dictated by FEMA's maps. So that's all stuff that's outside our jurisdiction. So people who are having maybe trouble selling their house because of high flood insurance, that has nothing to do with the Conservation Commission, and it has nothing to do with how much the flood insurance is. That is FEMA that is dictating that.
Okay. And then in the answer previous to that, I think you said that as an example of things that you all have had come across your radar screen, there have been projects in Nahant that involved changing of flow onto neighbors' lands in terms of large reconstructions, but those effects were something that you all reckon to be beyond your ability to control even with the bylaw. Is that right?
Not with the bylaw. If we had the bylaw, we would have control over that. We would be able to we'd be able to prevent issues for neighbors.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi.
Sally Slagle, 75 Castle Road. I'm sorry I came a little bit late, so maybe I missed some of the things, and it may be redundant. But I'm on Castle Road, obviously in the floodplain, and we have pilings. No seawall where I am, but there is seawall further down. I guess my question is, this would affect the ability to increase pilings if needed, replace pilings, create seawalls if that's optional, or repair seawalls. So I don't know if you talked about those things. That would come under this bylaw and also the current standards, correct?
Correct. Good question.
Okay.
So the Wetlands Protection Act very clearly regulates work in those situations. So that's what's going to dictate those situations. Seawalls cannot be built on houses that are newer than I can't remember the age, I don't know, 1978. It's 1978. So if the house is older than 1978, you can build a seawall with a permit. You can absolutely repair foundations, pilings, seawalls. You'll need a permit. So you needed one before, you will still need one. That doesn't change for you at all. You're welcome. And just, it's worth noting, after last year's storms, 2018 March storms, we have had a lot of people coming and requesting to repair their foundations and their seawalls. And the biggest holdup that we've had has been DEP. They have their eye on Nahant, and they've been very closely watching what we've been doing, because for a long time, we've been a little lax, quite frankly. So DEP has been what's held up some of these projects, just requiring a lot of information so people can do their projects. We haven't, some people have had to wait a month or two for DEP to get on board with what they wanted to do, but we have absolutely approved everyone's permit because it's a health and safety issue. We are not interested in endangering people in their homes. That's critically important to us. We live here, we're your neighbors, we do not want that. So that's something that we absolutely work with applicants to help make sure they can get things fixed as quickly as they can.
Once again, just to clarify, the involvement of DEP is independent of the existence of this bylaw, correct?
Yes.
All right. So the problems that homeowners who are applying for permits have had with DEP, it's after things have left y'all's hands, and there's some review required by DEP that is outside of your influence.
DEP's involvement is on the front end. So when you submit a permit application, DEP reviews it, and if they don't think it's sufficient, then they won't issue a file number. If they don't issue a file number, we cannot issue a permit. So that's how they keep themselves relevant in the process, is they don't let you continue on down the road unless they sign off initially.
Okay, but the process you just described is the way it would be even without this new bylaw.
Correct, correct. So even if the bylaw is repealed, anybody that lives on the ocean in these red and orange areas, they still have to come to the Conservation Commission. If you live on the ocean, if you live within 100 feet of the ocean, if you live in floodplain, regardless of whether or not we have a bylaw, you still have to come to the Conservation Commission. That will not change. Does anybody else have any questions?
Just trying to get this right. Okay. So I'm in the orange, red, and yellow, all three of those colors. So, and I know I was in the orange and pink since 1972 or whatever, since we have the mass law. Okay. So, yeah, we have the yellow. Again, just one more time, I'm kind of slow, I'm getting old. The orange and the pink that I have, am I going to the state if I wanted to do an adjustment in that part of my property?
No, you come to us.
Okay, excuse me. Are you going to look at the state law or the town law?
If we continue to have the bylaw, we will look at both. Because technically, if some of your property's in floodplain, that would affect, I don't know specifically your property, but both the Wetlands Protection Act and the bylaw will affect your property. So anybody in the red and orange, it's the Wetlands Protection Act and the bylaw. If you live in the yellow zone, it is just the bylaw.
Are you talking about the seawall? Your seawall?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find out the
Seawall
difference.
would-
I was under the idea that the pink and the orange was pretty much the same with the state mandate and the town bylaw.
Yeah, the state law will dictate what happens in the red and orange zones,
That's
primarily.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
with the exception of floodplain. So if you live on the ocean, if it's coastal bank, if it is buffer zone to coastal bank, the Wetlands Protection Act is going to dictate that because the law is very strong on that point. If you live in floodplain, that's when the bylaw will come into play.
And And what you folks are trying, well, the bylaw is trying to do is to alleviate water going into your neighbors, or a whole lot of water going into the wetlands. It doesn't need to go into the wetlands, because eventually, if it's in the wetlands, it's probably going in some folks' home, you know. So this is trying to alleviate the amount of water going into the
Yeah.
wetlands. Is that correct?
Yeah, to the extent that we can. You know, I think people don't do anything intentionally, but there are unintentional consequences sometimes. And so it's just giving us an opportunity to look at that to help prevent those problems before they become an issue for people.
Yeah. The way I'm looking at it is we're trying to avoid flooding in people's houses.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the way
Yes.
I look at it.
And to lessen our flooding.
I'm sorry, this is an honest question. This isn't a rhetorical question at all. But I seem to recall from reading the bylaw and from the rules and regs that the bylaw, what was just said about if you're in a pink zone or an orange zone, the requirements of the Wetlands Protection Act, the state act, are applicable. But I recall that I can't remember if it was in the law or in the regs, it says now instead of saying Wetlands Protection Act, you say Wetlands Protection Bylaw. So in fact, even if you're not in the buffer zone, if you're in the pink or orange zones, you're now governed by the bylaw.
You're governed by both.
You're governed by both, but
Right.
the whole megillah about having to apply to having to appeal, if you needed to appeal, you would be covered in that sense. You'd be appealing from the bylaw. Remember, there was that, I can't find it right now, but there was a section where it said cross out Wetlands Protection Act and say Nahant Wetlands Protection Bylaw. As I say, this is a real question. I seem to remember that under the law and the regs, you said the same standards will apply, but now you're applying or appealing or whatever under the bylaw. So it's not like the yellow people apply one place and the pink and orange people apply another place.
So the yellow people will appeal if they need to.
They do, yeah. They may not need to.
They would have to appeal to Superior Court. If you live in the red or orange area, you would appeal to both, DEP and Superior Court. Yeah, you can say.
Seriously?
Could I respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that under the way the courts look at this, the way the law is, that if there's a decision that is effectively duplicative, same issue, the state law supersedes, and the appeal would be to DEP. So in the orange area,
Okay.
you're almost entirely, since this bylaw is targeted to flooding, as far as I'm concerned, and flooding is obviously a significant problem here in Nahant. The orange is going to be an appeal to DEP. Only really the yellow is going to have an appeal to the Superior Court, so long as we're dealing with the same issue.
Thank you. My mistake. To be honest with you, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've only seen a handful of appeals. It is infrequent at best, and they were odd situations. So I've never appealed a project, so I would defer to an attorney. I don't know the specifics of that. Anybody else have any questions before we wrap up?
Sally Slagle, 75 Castle Road. That just brought another question. So if having this bylaw, does that mean that there may be more of these appeals that might be needed because the bylaw is stricter? There will be more cases that will be denied?
I don't
necessarily, or
anticipate that, no.
Okay, I was just curious because that was kind of how it sounded. Now we have more control, there's going to be more regulation, then does that mean that there's going to be more need for the appeals?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't see why that would be
Not
the outcome.
necessarily.
No. I don't.
I don't see the approach of the
I just
conserv-
keep- that
yeah,
just-
I don't see the approach of the Conservation Committee changing, which our approach is always, how do we make a project happen, as long as we can do so in a way that's safe for neighbors and floodplain.
Within the regulations
Yeah.
and laws, okay.
And usually it's minor adjustments to a project that help prevent issues. And so in the past, we've worked with people and they've been willing to make minor adjustments and they were able to go on their way. So it hasn't been an issue historically, and I don't anticipate it being an issue in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, then we will conclude this meeting. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. If you have any additional questions, you are welcome to email the Conservation Commission. Our email address is conservation@nahant.org. We monitor the email address, and we're happy to respond to any questions by email, or we're happy to give you a call. So thank you. Have a good night.